What's up, everybody? I'm Michael Hanley, and I've never done this before. I've never done stand-up comedy, but when my AP Lit grade, high school graduation, college acceptance, and ultimately my future were on the line, I decided to say, screw it, let's try new things. If that's not senior year, I really don't know what is. Obviously, I checked out some credible sources for this, as I would for any assignment at McQuaid. And what Wikipedia told me was the hardest part of stand-up was a fear of failure. For my entire life, I've never had a fear of failure because in a lot of places I really wasn't supposed to succeed. If anyone in this class and I were to play one-on-one basketball, I should lose. People make a lot of snap judgments upon meeting people. And even now, a lot of people, I'm sure, are making judgments based on how this routine's going. See, I've never really been good at first impressions. Frankly, look at me. I was born, and I grew up to be this incredibly hot guy, like a perfect 10. And now when people see me, they assume I'm just a pretty face, or to quote the common expression, a hot piece of ass and nothing more. And it was through this that I connected with Edna Pontellier from Kate Chopin's The Awakening. See, Edna is a woman trapped in a male-dominated society, and no one sees her for what she actually is. When people look at Edna, like when they look at me, they couldn't see this incredibly complex and intelligent human being, but instead all they saw was a woman. Or in my case, this incredibly attractive Herculean figure that everybody wants to be and everybody loves all the time. And as I read this book, I related more and more, and I was interested to see how Edna would resolve her situation. And in one final freeing action, she killed herself by walking into the ocean. As she swims out, each stroke takes her further and further away from the oppressive society she lives in. And she dies in this incredibly powerful act of defiance, and sending the message that I would rather be dead than live like this. And I thought about how powerful a message that was, and how that would affect the society, except that literally no one in the story other than Edna and maybe a few close friends would get it. Edna didn't leave a note explaining what was going on, so instead of this being some powerful example for feminine independence, Edna plays right into a stereotype. People are going to be sitting at the bar that Friday like, hey, did you hear about Leonce's wife? Oh yeah, she died swimming. What an idiot. Women, right? High five. Like, instead of starting a dialogue about how women are maybe equal in the society, all that Edna has done is create the Edna Pontellier rule, which will stipulate all women at Grand Isle will now have to wear floaties to go swimming. Great job, Edna. You go, sister. Fight the power. See, I guess I shouldn't be surprised that I related to Edna, other than her struggle mirroring my own struggle in many ways. I relate to her in another way. I remember last year in my junior English class, we did a poetry unit that was dedicated to reciting poetry from memory. Obviously, I chose a very, very short poem, and it was a lullaby to the American South after the Civil War. Mr. Herschel commented before the entire class that I had done a great job picking my poem because my voice had this matronly quality. You can imagine my English class filled with 16 and 17-year-old boys found that hilarious, but in one aspect, I guess it's true. I've never been the most masculine guy. If you were to open up my closet, you'd find some pastel clothes. I'm not out there with Riley Benner's level, but they're in there. And this allowed me to relate to another character we read about, Jake Barnes. See, Jake Barnes is a man who was physically emasculated by the Great War. Before anybody panics, I'm not about to pull a Donald Trump and start talking about my penis, but it's important to understand that Jake Barnes was this strapping image of vitality. And after his experiences in World War II, he now resides closer to the Ken doll end of that spectrum. And I've had such an emasculating experience myself. After my freshman year of high school, I obtained a scuba diving certification. And before we went out on the dive boat, they said, if you get motion sickness, you may want to take some Dramamine or something. Now me, being someone who throws up on planes and cannot read without risking vomiting, decided, nah, I don't really need that. I've never been sick on the select number of times I've been on a kayak on a flat lake. Why should the open ocean be any different? So we go, and you guessed it, I start feeling sick. They line us up to jump off the back of this boat, and I'm feeling it. The captain of the boat begins shouting dive, and people begin moving forward in this line and jumping off. And it's now I realize I have to vomit. And as I brazenly step across the boat to the trash can, the flipper I have on catches in the front. And it catches on the ground, and it throws me forward. And I'm flopped down onto the deck like a fish. I find myself lying expressionless, flopping around, trying to get up. Now, the 40 pounds of gear, the oxygen tank, and my own utter refusal to participate in any sort of leg day in my 15 years left me pinned to that boat deck. So I pulled the trash can tight to my chest, like a child would hug a teddy bear after a nightmare, and began to vomit. Then, this boat hand comes from behind me, and he picks me up from the back and walks me to the back of the boat, where I will presumably finish vomiting, now into the ocean. Then this man, in one swift motion, grabs me and tosses me up in the air and off the boat. It was here, in my figurative shot-in-the-dick moment, that I was emasculated. See, Jake Barnes came to sort of be defined by his injury, and the way Jake deals with his impotence is he simply comes to terms with it. Jake accepts that he can never be with Lady Brett Ashley, and in this I found some solace. Instead of eating more protein powder than Jake Lord and working out every day to overcome his seeming emasculation, Jake just comes to terms with it. He enjoys his bullfights and his whiskey. And I can relate to that, as I've never felt the need to overcompensate for not being much of a macho man. But Hemingway loses me on the very last page of that book. See, in the end, Brett mentions how Jake and she could have had such a damned good time together. And instead of freaking out because, are you kidding me? You say that? Jake just very calmly says, yes, isn't it pretty to think so? But are you kidding me? The love of this dude's life basically just says to him, you know, if you weren't injured in that war that has undoubtedly scarred your life and left you emotionally shattered and will probably cause your life to be shortened, we'd have been quite the couple. And that's like going up to a homeless guy who's begging for change on the street and saying, I'd love to toss you some money, but really, how much would it help? You'll still be homeless in the morning. That's absurd. If I were Jake, I'd have had some choice words for Brett that old Edna and the rest of the feminine movement wouldn't have been too happy with. Obviously, I can see Jake's decision is the better one, because in the long term, it allows him to remain friends with Brett. But I wouldn't think long term like that. I operate in the here and now, making snap decisions like any good teenage boy would. And it was that allowed me to see myself in Victor Frankenstein. See, Victor Frankenstein is interested in science, and this interest takes him so far as to build this huge monster. Then, the minute he builds this freak and brings it to life, he panics and runs away, hoping things will resolve themselves, everything's going to work out. I'm not about to confess the reason I can relate to Victor Frankenstein is because John Falwell and I built Andrew Vaccaro in my garage, but I do understand that sort of instant, oh shit, reaction you get after you do something. Frankenstein literally runs away from trouble, and believe me, if I could have done that on some report card Thursdays, I absolutely would have. Over the course of Mary Shelley's novel, we see Frankenstein change from this vulnerable, scared young man who refuses to even acknowledge his creation, at the end, a hardened man who vows to fix what he's done by going so far as to track his monster down to the ends of the earth and kill it. In a more serious vein, I can relate to that, as my grades from Really 8th until 10th grade were a result of slacking and a lack of personal accountability, and between this and last year, I worked to pull them up to apply to college. And that seems to be a common pattern among boys. We all go from asking, come on guys, who was it, after we just shouted an obscenity in the cheering section, to brazenly staring down teachers in the cafeteria while we sing a certain song about mosquitoes that apparently no one likes. We grow up, and with that comes accountability and the courage to admit our own faults. Luckily, the road to that place doesn't always involve our inadvertent killing of 5 people, but hey, we get there. And after reading these 3 works and reflecting on my time at McQuaid, I was feeling pretty good. I realized how much I'd matured and grown as a person, and I thought I was ready to enter the world as a critical thinker to become a functioning, productive member of society. And then we read 1984. You might imagine I had a tough time seeing myself in a forward-thinking person who was oppressed through an authoritarian administration above him, who sought to control every facet of his life, but somehow, when reflecting on my McQuaid experience, I can relate with that. See, I respected Winston as I too have a rebellious streak in me, and that surprises a lot of people, as depending on the day, I'll look anywhere from a 40-year-old office worker to a 70-year-old retiree who lives in Jupiter, Florida. Right now I look like a dad. But I do have a rebellious streak in me. I'll often do reckless things that fly in the face of establishment, like mixing khakis, or even going so far as to wearing jeans without a belt. But unlike Winston, I've never felt that level of oppression that doesn't even allow him to be an individual. I mean, clearly no one has ever tried to control what level of exercise I do when I wake up, and no one has ever tortured me for not conforming. When O'Brien exposes Winston as a free thinker and has him tortured, the torture that ultimately breaks Winston is when he's confronted with a cage of rats right in his face. Anyone who's ever walked down the middle school hallway at like 2:40 on a school day can absolutely relate with that. When Winston gets broken, he comes to legitimately believe that 2 plus 2 equals 5, and he remarks about how he loves Big Brother. As I read this, I wondered if ignorance was truly bliss, and would it be better for me to just be a stupid, hot kid? But then I thought about how over the course of my McQuaid career, I've seen myself in a lot of literary figures. From a sexually awakened woman, to an oppressed man, to a mad scientist, and even to a World War I veteran. See, I think McQuaid has taught me to be every facet of myself, and this allows me to relate to many different characters. This education clearly has taught me a lot about how to live and get by. And if you don't believe that, I just got away with doing a stand-up routine that was 13 minutes in place of a 10-page thesis paper. So clearly I learned something. Thanks for listening, and Mr. Boone, please, for the love of God, don't fail me.